Breaking news coming in. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking right now after the U.S. slapped Canada with 25% tariff.
But let me tell Americans, we're not booing you. We're not booing your teams. We're not booing your players. We're booing a policy that is designed to hurt us.
The morning air in Latvia carried a chill, the kind that makes soldiers stand taller and leaders choose their words with extra weight. On the outskirts of the Adazi military base, the flags of more than a dozen allied nations rippled in the wind. Each banner a reminder of sacrifice, unity, and the fragile nature of peace. Cameras were rolling, soldiers stood in formation, and the world leaned closer to listen. Prime Minister Marcus Carney of Canada once considered a quiet, measured voice on the global stage was about to deliver the most defiant address of his career. His audience wasn't just the rows of Canadian troops stationed abroad, nor the NATO partners who had gathered to signal unity. His true audience was the world itself, friends, foes, and especially those who doubted whether democracies could withstand the rising tide of authoritarianism. The moment he began to speak, it was clear this wasn't going to be another diplomatic platitude or ceremonial reassurance. His voice carried steel. "We no longer live in a time of ease," he declared, his eyes moving across the assembled forces. "The era of tranquility has ended. What we face now is a world shaped by brute force, and only greater force can preserve the freedoms we hold dear." It was a bold declaration, not just a warning, but a call to arms for every democracy struggling under the shadow of rising aggression. To many, it was also an unmistakable rebuke to those who had chosen retreat and appeasement. Though he never uttered the name directly, everyone knew who he meant: former U.S. President Donald Trump, whose wavering alliances and submissive gestures to Moscow had shaken NATO's foundation. The Canadian leader's words didn't just sting, they burned. And they set the stage for a new chapter in global politics. A world divided. The setting for Carney's speech was symbolic. Latvia, once crushed under Soviet rule, now stood as a sovereign nation because its people had dared to resist. The base at Adazi wasn't merely a hub for soldiers. It was a fortress of history, a living testament to what it meant to claw freedom out of the jaws of tyranny. Carney leaned heavily on that symbolism. He reminded his audience that history has an unforgiving memory. Nations that forget its lessons are destined to repeat its horrors. Standing before the troops, he evoked the ghosts of past wars, pointing to the cost of underestimating authoritarians from Hitler to Stalin to today's Kremlin. Authoritarianism thrives when democracies fall asleep, he warned. But let there be no mistake, Canada is wide awake. Our allies are awake, and together we will not bend to aggression. We will not allow fear to outlast freedom. His message was not only directed eastward at Russia, but also westward across the Atlantic. Allies were still reeling from years of American retreat from its leadership role. Where Washington once carried the torch for democratic order, it now wavered, its credibility fractured by division at home and reckless diplomacy abroad. Carney was, in many ways, telling the world that someone had to pick up the torch. Canada was ready to carry it. The troops behind him, behind Carney, stood rows of Canadian soldiers, helmets gleaming, uniforms pressed with sharp precision. But these weren't just ceremonial props for a leader's photo op. They represented years of sacrificed young men and women who had left behind families, jobs, and ordinary lives to guard democracy's frontier. Their presence gave his words muscle. "It is your service, your sacrifice," Carney said, turning to face them directly. "That makes Canada strong. You are the front line in the battle between freedom and fear. And make no mistake, this is a struggle we will win, because together, we are stronger." The applause that followed wasn't just polite. It thundered across the base like a drumbeat of resolve for the soldiers, many of whom had seen firsthand the consequences of Russian aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere. These weren't empty words. They were a promise. Drawing the line, Carney's speech had another layer, was also a map of where the world stood. He reminded everyone of the path that had brought them here. Canada being the first G7 nation to recognize Latvia's independence in 1991. Operation Unifier training over 45,000 Ukrainian soldiers since Russia's annexation of Crimea. And the creation of multinational brigades across the Baltics to deter Putin's ambitions. This wasn't a history lesson. It was a reminder that democracies had stood up before and could do so again. But the line he drew was sharper than ever. Putin is no Gorbachev, he declared. We cannot trust but verify. We must deter and fortify. We must stand taller, stronger, and more united than he ever imagined possible. The soldiers listened. The cameras rolled. And audiences across the globe couldn't ignore the implication where some leaders had knelt before authoritarian strongmen. Carney was drawing a line in the sand with a firm, unyielding hand, a not-so-subtle contrast. While the speech was filled with talk of strategy, alliances, and military investments, it was impossible to separate it from the larger political undercurrent. The contrast with Donald Trump's posture toward Russia was glaring. Where Trump had once stumbled in public beside Vladimir Putin, appearing weak, confused, or even submissive, Carney was sharp, confident, and defiant. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Leadership matters. Strength isn't about handshakes or slogans. It's about standing firm when democracy is under siege. And in that moment, the Canadian Prime Minister was seizing the role many had once expected from Washington. The leader of the free world. The hook for what's to come. That morning at Adasi wasn't just about military policy. It was about a shift in the narrative of global leadership. Nations were watching, some with relief, others with resentment as Canada stepped into a role larger than its size might suggest. But there was more beneath the surface. This wasn't only a speech, it was a declaration that the world was entering a chapter where smaller nations, unshackled by old assumptions, might rise to meet threats while former giants stumbled in retreat. And for Carney, this was just the beginning. His speech was not an ending note, was a spark meant to ignite a larger fire. Because if freedom was to endure, someone had to step forward. Someone had to look dictators in the eye and say, this far, no further. And that someone, at least in this chapter of history, was Canada. The applause at Adasi faded, but the echo of Carney's words carried far beyond the base. News outlets replayed his speech across Europe. Analysts dissected every sentence, and adversaries took careful note. In capitals from Moscow to Washington, the question wasn't whether he had spoken boldly, was what those words meant for the fragile balance of global power. For soldiers in Latvia, however, the speech was more than just rhetoric. It was validation. Their presence on the Baltic frontier had often been questioned back home. Why risk Canadian lives for a conflict thousands of kilometers away? Carney had answered that doubt with sharp clarity. Because freedom doesn't defend itself. But to understand why his speech hit so hard, one had to trace the long shadow of history, the scars left by past aggressions, and the memories that still shaped Europe's fragile order. Latvia's long memory. Latvia's independence was young, just over 3 decades old, but its wounds were ancient. For 50 years, it had lived under Soviet domination. Its culture suppressed, its people monitored, its freedoms extinguished. The Red Army had once marched freely through its streets, and the KGB had haunted every whisper. For Latvians, sovereignty was not an abstract principle, was survival. That is why the Adasi base carried such heavy symbolism. Here, soldiers from over a dozen nations stood shoulder to shoulder, each uniform a reminder that Latvia was no longer alone. Carney knew this history well. Those who forget are condemned to repeat it. He had told reporters earlier on the trip. His choice of words wasn't accidental. He wanted to anchor the present struggle in the lessons of the past, because in Latvia, the past is never far away. The Canadian commitment. Canada's journey to this point hadn't been sudden. In 1991, it became the first G7 country to recognize Latvia's independence. In 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, Canada launched Operation Unifier to train Ukrainian soldiers. Then, as Moscow's threats to the Baltics intensified, Canadian forces became the backbone of NATO's presence in Latvia. At first, it had been modest, just over 100 troops. But as the years unfolded, Canada's role grew. By 2017, the NATO battle group at Adasi had expanded, with Canada leading the brigade. By 2023, it numbered over 3,500 soldiers from 14 nations, a multinational force designed not just to fight, if necessary, to send a message. NATO's line was here, and it would not be crossed. Carney's announcement of a renewed Operation Reassurance extended another 3 years wasn't just a policy update. It was a warning to the Kremlin that Canada's resolve was deepening, not fading. The world watching. Carney's speech resonated because the world was searching for clarity in uncertain times. Russia's war in Ukraine had dragged on longer than expected, with devastating civilian tolls, missile strikes on cities, power outages across regions, and thousands of lives lost painted a grim picture of the costs of unchecked aggression. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States, the traditional anchor of NATO, appeared adrift. Trump's years had left scars, strained alliances, diminished trust, and a perception of weakness that Putin had exploited. Even after Trump's departure from office, the fractures lingered. America no longer seemed the unquestioned leader of the free world. Carney's defiance, therefore, filled a void. It wasn't that Canada could replace the sheer military might of the USA couldn't. But leadership isn't always about size. Sometimes it's about courage at the right moment. And Carney had chosen his moment well. Authoritarianism's advance. The speech was also a reminder of the stakes. The struggle wasn't confined to Ukraine or Latvia. Around the globe, authoritarian leaders were testing boundaries, some with tanks, others with disinformation, corruption, and intimidation. Carney named it plainly. This is the front line between freedom and fear. Those words reverberated because authoritarianism was no longer a distant problem. It was knocking on the doors of democracies everywhere. From the Baltics to Africa, from Asia to the Americas, leaders who admired power more than principle were rising. They thrived when democracies bickered, when alliances fractured, when cynicism eroded belief in freedom. Carney's declaration that democracies would prevail, that Canada would stand at the spear's edge, wasn't just about Europe. It was about proving that free nations could still summon the will to resist. The subtle rebuke. Of course, everyone noticed the subtext. Carney never said Trump's name. He didn't have to. The comparison was unavoidable. Where Trump had fumbled alongside Putin, Carney stood tall against him. Where Trump had wavered on NATO's purpose, Carney reaffirmed it with steel. And where Trump had courted authoritarians, Carney condemned them without hesitation. For many watching, it was a relief. At last, a Western leader was speaking the language of strength without apology. For others, it was unsettling. If Canada was stepping into this role, what did it say about America's retreat? But for Carney, the calculation was simple. History would not wait. Beyond the speech, what came after the speech was equally significant. Carney and his defense minister announced billions in new defense spending, quadrupling Canada's military investment by the decade's end. Plans for new ships, drones, aircraft, and munitions were laid out, alongside the creation of a new procurement agency to speed up delivery. These weren't just budget lines. They were signals to allies that Canada was serious, and to adversaries that it was preparing for the long fight ahead. In Brussels, Berlin, and Warsaw, the message was welcomed. In Moscow, it was noted with disdain, and in Washington, it sparked uncomfortable comparisons. A leader emerges. Leaders aren't always born in the glare of headlines. Often, they rise slowly, their influence building step by step until one moment crystallizes it all. For Carney, Addazi was that moment. The image of him standing before the troops, voice unwavering, cutting through the wind with a message of defiance. That image traveled fast. It told the world that Canada, often underestimated, was ready to shoulder responsibility. The speech was not just about Russia or even NATO. It was about the future of democratic resolve in a world where the balance was shifting. And in that sense, it wasn't merely a Canadian message. It was a universal one. The storm ahead. Yet speeches, no matter how powerful, don't win battles. Carney knew this. The storm ahead was real. Russian aggression was intensifying. Ukrainian cities were still under bombardment. Energy crises loomed. Economic strains tested alliances. And authoritarianism wasn't retreating, it was advancing. Addazi had been a rallying cry, but it was also a warning shot. Democracies couldn't just talk. They had to act, invest, and endure. The soldiers on the parade ground understood it instinctively. Their lives, their training, their sacrifices were daily proof of it. And now their prime minister had matched their courage with words. The question was whether the rest of the world would follow. Carney's chapter of leadership had begun. But history would demand more than speeches. It would demand choices, sacrifices, and resilience. The storm was gathering, and the world would soon learn whether democracy's defenders were as strong as their words.